I have had a few canning projects on my to-do list for a while. The cooler months are always slower in this regard, which makes it the perfect time to get to any canning that isn't as time sensitive. So join me in the kitchen this week for a little bit of winter preserving. If you're new to my channel, welcome. My name's Abby. If you're not, I'm happy to have you back. I am starting out today with prepping some potatoes to can up. Now, I always like to have a stash of canned potatoes on the pantry shelf. Obviously, potatoes store well for months in a cool space without canning. I just find it really convenient to have some on hand. And home canned potatoes cooked up in a hot cast iron skillet get a perfect crispy outside while being nice and soft inside. So I have a variety of potatoes from last year's garden that I have washed up well. I am using a mix of russets, chieftain, and side-gland potatoes, and as I peel those, I am just transferring them to a clean sink full of cold water to prevent any browning. Chopping those into somewhat uniform pieces, and then I'm transferring those back into cold water. This is also going to help pull some starch from the potatoes. Now, testa recipes are going to recommend the potatoes be boiled for a couple minutes depending on the size before canning. That is how I have done it in the past, but recently I have changed up how I process them and I am raw packing these. In the all-new ball book, they do have some seasoned potato recipes that are raw packed. I feel comfortable with this, but if you don't, just take the extra step to boil them. I prepped these potatoes the evening before and allowed them to sit in the cold water overnight just to split up the process a little bit, and I do like to drain off and rinse the potatoes a couple times to remove some of that starch. The liquid is going to stay more clear in the jar this way after canning. I am canning my potatoes in quart-sized jars today. I have those clean and ready to go. I often see questions on my canning videos about sterilizing jars. It's actually not necessary to sterilize if you are pressure canning or if you're water bath canning and processing for 10 minutes or longer. Obviously, you still want to start out with clean jars. I'm filling my jars to an inch of headspace. As far as seasoning goes, I am keeping these plain today and just adding a teaspoon of salt per quart jar. You can opt to leave that out if you want. I do have another video here on my channel sharing a variety of ways you can season them, and I like to have some of those on the pantry shelf as well, but I am keeping this batch plain just for versatility. Once I have my jars filled, I am topping them off with water, again to an inch of headspace, then debubbling with a chopstick and adjusting headspace as needed. Clean off the rims of the jars well and adding on my lids and rings to fingertip tight. I'm always using my favorite 4 jars canning lids. They never fail me, and I do always have a discount code for those in the description box down below if you're looking to save a few dollars on canning supplies. I use a Presto 23 quart pressure canner that requires 3 quarts of water or to the bottom fill line, and I make sure to match the temperature of the water to the jars. With this canner, I can process 7 quarts at a time, so I did have to do 2 batches to run through the pressure canner today. Adding on the lid, turning on the element, and once I see a steady stream of steam coming out of the vent pipe, I'll allow the canner to vent for 10 minutes before adding on the regulator and then bringing it up to pressure. Processing time starts once the canner has come up to pressure. For my elevation, using a dial gauge pressure canner, I am processing at 11 pounds of pressure for 40 minutes for quarts. If you're using a weighted gauge pressure canner, it would be 10 pounds of pressure, adjusting as needed if above 1,000 feet of elevation. Once processing time is up, I turned off the heat, allow the canner to come down to 0, then crack the lid of the canner for a few minutes. Allow the jars to cool in there before removing, which is going to help prevent siphoning. I actually did rush through this batch a little bit, and I did have a little bit of siphoning because I was eager to get going on the next batch. Before getting started on the next batch of potatoes, I did empty out the canner and add water again to make sure that there was enough in there and that the temperature matched for the next batch, and then I just followed through that same process. While the last batch of potatoes was processing, I got started on a small batch of blackberry jam. I had a gallon bag of frozen blackberries from the garden that had partially thawed and then refrozen, so they were stuck together in a brick and not a great option for smoothies, which is what I most often use them for, so jam was their fate. Added those to a Dutch oven with some sugar. There's still quite a bit of sugar in this, but this is considered a lower sugar jam. And I'm going to be allowing those to macerate as the pressure canner finishes up with those potatoes. That's just going to help break down the berries some and pull out the juice, which will help speed up this process. So I am just heating those blackberries up over medium-low heat. I did add in some fresh lemon juice, and I'm going to allow those to simmer until the blackberries really start to break down. Now, we have a couple different varieties of blackberries here on our property. These ones are quite seedy, so I'm going to make a seedless jam with them. You can use a food mill for this. I just didn't feel like grabbing mine out for a small batch, so I am using a fine mesh strainer over a bowl. Pouring those blackberries through and then just pressing them to make sure I get all that pulp and juice from them and it's just the seeds remaining. Transferred that pulp and juice back into my pot, and I brought that up to a boil, turned down the heat, and allowed that to simmer for about 15 to 20 minutes until it begins to gel. You can test this a couple ways by spooning a bit of the jam onto a plate that's been in the freezer, or you can do it by temperature. This jam I'm making without pectin. Some jams I do use pectin for, and if I do, it's always Pomona's pectin, which allows you to use a little bit less sugar. But especially for a small batch like this, I choose to do without. I'm filling clean, hot, half-pint jars to a 1/4 inch of headspace. I was a little shy on that for one jar, so in that case, I just make sure that that is the first jar that we grab for. Clean off the rims really well, add lids and rings to fingertip tight, and these are ready to process in a Waterbath canner. As always, I'll have the full recipe in the description box down below. The thing that I can most in the cooler months is definitely broth for a couple reasons. One being that I do not want to be making broth in the summer months. Of course, we are also consuming less of it in the summer months as well. It's something that I always like to have on hand because whenever I cook grains, I almost always cook it in broth to add some nutrition and flavor as well. I had a chicken carcass from a chicken I had cooked up earlier in the day, and I also had a bunch of chicken necks and feet in the freezer from butchering that I needed to get used up. So I got my big stainless steel roasting pan filled up with all of those bones. Sometimes I like to do just a plain broth with no seasonings for a little bit more versatility. For this one, I just added in a few very small onions that I had left from the garden that I'm working through. Now, in theory, I would use all the small onions first because they have a shorter shelf life, but I haven't been great about that this year, so that actually is another task that I need to get to soon. I'm probably just going to end up dicing up a bunch of smaller onions to freeze. I also added in a carrot, and something I have been doing in the summer is dehydrating celery leaves. They make a great addition to broth, and I just brought that up to a boil for a bit, then reduced it down to a simmer, covered the roaster, and I let that simmer all night long. The next morning, the broth was ready to drain off, and I filled my clean hot quart-sized jars to an inch of headspace. I did skim off as much fat as I could before filling the jars to make sure that I get a good seal on these. Cleaned off the rims really well. I like to use a little bit of white vinegar for that, and added lids and rings to fingertip tight, and these are ready to process in the pressure canner. Quarts process for 25, pints process for 20. In this case, when I have both size jars, I'm always processing for the longer processing time. The potatoes and jam had sat out overnight, so I checked the seals on those. Everything sealed up beautifully, and so those were ready to prep for storage. I'm just removing the rings, cleaning up the jars, and labeling those. I love canning in the cooler months because there's a little bit less pressure to get things done than there is in the summer and fall when we have a ton coming in and lots to get through. Thank you for joining me in the kitchen today as I work on a few little winter projects to restock our pantry. I'll see you in the next video.